Greenwich Village, 1911, a region of New York that was home to a number of immigrant communities. European immigrants from Germany, Italy, and Ireland settled into the neighborhood with hopes of finding work and housing. Simultaneously, it was becoming home to the American Bohemia and a group of politically like-minded people referred to as the Greenwich Village Left. Artists, activists, and journalists found each other and built their communities within the neighborhood, some from highly educated backgrounds and others from small Midwestern farm towns. The Ivy Leaguers and the working class coming together, despite their incredibly different life experiences. And yet, Greenwich Village would also become the site of tragedy, of fire, death, and possible corruption. Hello, I'm Dominique Dibbell. Today we'll be exploring America's most deadly workplace tragedy of the 20th century, and how both the culture and time and the individuals in charge contributed to the loss of 146 innocent lives at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. On this episode of Haunting History. March 25, 1911 was a typical workday until 4:40 p.m. that afternoon. Located in what was known at the time as the Ash Building, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was located on floors 8 through 10, with the lower floors dedicated to other factories and retail space. Owned by the Shirtwaist Kings, Isaac Harris and Max Blank, they focused on the production of the highly popular garment in the name itself, the shirtwaist. This was one of the first articles of women's clothing to become hugely popular among all social classes, due to it being both fashionable and more comfortable than many of the trends before it. In a factory like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, a typical day often meant sharing close quarters with over 500 fellow workers. A vast majority of these workers were young girls and women between the ages of 14 and 20, many of them from Italian, German, and Irish immigrant families. For the usual 13-hour day, there was sometimes one half-hour break, if the schedule allowed. During the busier seasons, it often didn't. Efficiency reigned supreme during this time period, and many decisions were made that prioritized productivity above all else. For example, doors were locked during the day to prevent employees from stealing or spending too much time using the restroom. Pay was low. In comparison to the spending power of the dollar today, there are estimates that workers were making between $3.50 and $6.50 an hour. One woman who participated in strikes for better conditions discussed general standards of her workplace as unsanitary. That's the word that is generally used, but there ought to be a worse one used. There had been a push for change only 2 years earlier, beginning in 1909. Garment workers, a group primarily made up of working-class women, organized a massive strike, demanding a shorter 52-hour work week, a 20% pay raise, and increased pay for overtime, among other things. 20,000 workers from 500 factories walked out during a demonstration that was later known as the Uprising of 20,000. Small and medium-sized factories fell into agreement with the demands of the demonstrators during the earlier days and weeks of what would end up being 3 months of demonstrating. However, the larger factories held out. Harris and Blank of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory met with owners of the 20 largest factories to form an association against meeting these demands. According to some reports, the association made decisions that even included hiring people to physically attack strikers and forming alliances with police, who would then move to arrest strikers. By February 1910, the strike had ended. Some of the demands had been met, such as an increase in pay, while others were successfully prevented by the coalition of large factory owners, such as becoming a union-only, closed factory. The goal of this had been to increase the power of the factory workers, should they want to push for further change. A little over a year later, the workdays were carrying on again as usual. What changed March 25th from being an ordinary day to a full-blown tragedy happened in only a matter of minutes. The exact series of events can't be known for sure, but what likely started as a discarded cigarette or a match into a rag bin of highly flammable materials and fabrics became an uncontrollable flame that would rip through the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory and several other floors in the Ash Building. Some reports claim there was an attempt to oust the initial flames before they grew out of control, but that the fire hose on site was rotted and rusted to the point of being unusable. This shortcoming would be one of many that would contribute to the 129 girls and women and the 17 men that lost their lives. A large portion of those that died on this day were girls aged 17 or younger. As the realization of imminent danger set in, workers began to panic and look for a means of escape. Some people rushed to the single elevator. During a previous inspection, the installation of a second elevator had been recommended, but it was never addressed. The elevator car could only hold a maximum of 12 people at a time. It broke down after 4 trips. With a lack of sprinkler system of any kind, there was nothing keeping the fire at bay. Others began running toward doors and stairwells, only to find them either locked, as was common practice during the workday, or unlocked, but only able to be opened inwardly. As hundreds of people piled against the doorways, there was no room to open the only unlocked doors against the building pressure of bodies. Those inside were running out of ways to escape. For many, using the fire escape outside was a solution, until it wasn't. People fled in droves, overloading a weak fire escape that soon collapsed due to a lack of sufficient support. Inspectors had previously also suggested the installation of an additional fire escape that went unmet. As firefighters finally arrived at the Ash Building, they began extending their ladders to try to rescue people from windows, only to discover that they stopped short at the 6th story of the building. Options for those located above, like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory workers, were dwindling. They wouldn't have access to the ladders. The situation was quickly becoming life or death. Nellie Ventura, an 18-year-old girl, recounted her harrowing escape to a newspaper.
I ran at once to the window opening on the fire escape on the 9th floor and cried to the other girls to follow me. I don't know what happened then, but I stepped out on the ladder and looked down. All below me was thick smoke, with red tongues of flame showing through at the 8th floor. At first I was too frightened to try and run through the fire, for I thought I would be burned to death. When I heard the screams of the other girls and heard the roar of the fire in back of me, I knew I had to go down that ladder or die there.
Firefighters set up nets for people who had no choice but to leap. Horrifically, this too would be an option that would soon fail. The impact of the fall from the many people leaping from such great heights caused the netting to break. Many people chose to jump, some believing netting might catch them, others knowing they had no other means of escape. Of the 146 deaths accounted for that day, around 50 were the result of people who jumped from the windows onto the street below. Those who witnessed this recalled the experience of being helpless onlookers to the scene. Journalist William Gunn Shepard wrote,
I learned a new sound that day, a sound more horrible than description can picture. The thud of a speeding living body on a stone sidewalk.
Despite the heartbreaking number of lives lost, some people were able to escape. 150 of those survivors were rescued by the quick thinking of 2 law students, Charles E. Creamer and Elias Conter. Creamer and Conter were in the building next door when they learned of the fire. They climbed to the top of their building, which stood 1 story higher than the Ash Building. They found and fastened together 2 ladders and used them to create a path between the 2 roofs. This makeshift apparatus saved the lives of 150 people who were able to successfully climb over and up from the Ash Building to theirs. In less than 30 minutes, it was all over. Families, friends, and onlookers gathered around the area, despite police orders, to try to identify the faces of the dead. In the time that followed, the focus turned to investigating the tragedy, with many demanding changes to prevent such a thing from happening again. The fire chief in charge at the time lamented,
This is the greatest loss of life at any fire I have ever known. I have prophesied over and over again that just such a thing was bound to happen in some loft building or office building. They call them fireproof and so think no fire escapes are necessary, but they are not fireproof, only slow burning. Such safeguards save buildings, but not human life.
Mourning and outrage soon turned to organizing. Less than 2 weeks later, on April 5, 1911, a crowd of around 100,000 people participated in the funeral procession for the victims down Fifth Avenue. They followed the hearses to the ceremony, where thousands more met up to pay their respects at the memorial. Some accounts even suggest upwards of 350,000 people attended to pay respects to the victims. Unions were among some of the first to demand justice, including the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. 1 week after the fire, union leader Rose Schneiderman stated,
"I would be a traitor to these poor burned bodies if I came here to talk good fellowship. Too much blood has been spilled. I know from my experience it is up to the working people to save themselves. The only way they can save themselves is by a strong working class movement."
And for those that did rally, they championed change. One woman named Frances Perkins actually witnessed the fire and saw young people jump to their deaths from where she was standing in Washington Square. Over the next 20 years, she took her prior experiences in social work, sociology, and economics to work to bring change at the executive level, and later declared that this was the day the New Deal was born. Perkins would end up being the first woman to ever serve in a president's cabinet as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor. During her time in FDR's cabinet, she helped pass worker protections on a national level, including the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act. These helped to protect workers' rights to organize and practice collective bargaining in the private sector. They also set standards for minimum wage, overtime pay, limits to child labor, and countless other protections. In the meantime, changes were also happening on the ground. By the end of June 1911, the Factory Investigating Commission was formed. They held public hearings, toured factories, and interviewed workers, eventually leading to the creation of 30 different health and safety laws. These laws ended up serving as a catalyst for future labor laws in the United States and led to the investigation of nearly 2,000 factories from various industries. Some of the laws the Commission set into motion required better fire safety measures, including outwardly swinging exit doors, sprinklers, and overall higher standards for sanitation and ventilation. While others were fighting for the future, some may have been left wondering, what about this fire and these victims? The owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, Isaac Harris and Max Blank, were indicted and stood trial for multiple counts of manslaughter as a result of the fire. But by December 1911, they were acquitted. They continued to navigate civil lawsuits for the next few years, which resulted in payouts that averaged around $75 per victim. However, their insurance payout was much greater than the fines the men were ordered to pay. They received nearly $60,000, about $400 per life lost, and actually made a profit in the end. Some people pointed fingers at previous factory fires that had happened at other sites Harris and Blank owned. Supposedly, insurance scams in the garment industry were common at the time, and the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory had a notably inflated fire insurance policy. However, the court did not find significant evidence of fraud, nor of intentional wrongdoing on the part of Harris and Blank that may have led to their employees' deaths. There are plenty of other aspects to this story that remain unclear, as some of the numbers and details of that day are debated. Some claim that the fire lasted only 18 minutes, while other sources report it lasted 30. Some say there were 500 people working that day, while others claim 800. Even the identities of 6 of the 146 total victims were unknown for 100 years. Thankfully, that was one mystery from March 25, 1911, that was finally solved in the year 2011. Genealogist Michael Hirsch was able to identify the 6 individuals whose identities were not known due to the severity of the burns and damage to their bodies. Their names and profiles were finally able to be added to the official victims list. Josephine CAMMARATA, age 17, Dora Evans, age 18, Max Florin, age 23, Maria Giuseppa Lauletti, age 33, Concetta Presti Filippo, age 22, and Fannie Rosen, age 21. Since then, many changes have been implemented to the workplace to ensure safety. In 1911, it's estimated that up to 100 workers died on the job every day in the United States. In 2020, 4,764 workplace fatalities were reported to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics for the entire year, averaging to around 13 people a day. And while any loss of life derived just from meeting the demands of a job is tragic, we've come a long way in worker safety. Thanks in large part to the activism of those who rallied around the victims of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, and many tragedies before and since. Thanks again for joining me. I'm Dominique Dibbell, and this has been another episode of Haunting History.